Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar for the State of Washington Supportive Housing Programs today. My name is Dawn Reinhardt Wood, and I am joined by my colleague Ken Kinter, who is going to be primarily leading this discussion. And we're going to be talking about process dependency. And you may have seen some language difference when you originally got the announcement. You may have seen the word addiction. So we're going to talk a little bit about language before we get started, but I just want to go ahead and let you know if you saw a little bit of change in language, you're not losing it. That is correct. There was change in some of the language and titling. So just to let you know that you are in the right place. So we welcome you. And this training will also be recorded for viewing later. So if you have to leave early or anything like that, know that there will be a recording sent out. Next slide, please. So just some minor housekeeping that I have to go through. We want to welcome you again. And today's webinar is being hosted by the Washington DBHR through the Healthcare Authority. This is an interactive training and we encourage you to ask questions and interact throughout the session. I will be paying attention to the chat box and any questions and answers that come in, anything you want to offer. So please, you don't have to hold them for the end of the training. We welcome your questions and comments as you think of them. And I will likely pause Ken at certain points throughout the training to pose some of your questions to him. The slides, as well as a link to the recording of this webinar, will be available in the follow-up email after the presentation. So you will receive a PDF handout of the slides. You will also receive a link to the recording of the webinar, and if there are any resources also shared. Next slide, please. So again, as you noticed when you came in, everyone was muted and your cameras are off, although we have fixed the chat box and you should be able to chat fine in there. Please do note when you are using the chat box to check who you were sending your message to. If you want it to be viewable by everybody, make sure the little drop-down box has selected everyone. I believe very often it just defaults to host and panelists. So make sure everyone is checked off, unless you do just want to send a message to Ken or myself. We'll call on you to open your microphone, or you could just type your question in the box. And again, feel free to ask questions as they arise. I'm not going to read all this.
Don't read all this.
What I'm going to say is I am joined today, and Ken is going to be leading our discussion today. Ken Kinter has a lot of years of experience, has more than me, and I like to say that because that makes me younger. And he has worked in a variety of settings in the community, in forensic settings, and within the psychiatric hospital, state psychiatric hospital settings. Currently, Ken is we used to call ourselves embedded consultants, but right now we're remotely embedded in the New Jersey State Psychiatric Hospitals, providing training and consultation and technical assistance around evidence-based practice on inpatient psychiatric rehabilitation. And he is this close away from earning his doctorate. And you don't need to know about me. Moving on. This is 2 shades of hair color ago, so move on. Okay, at this point, I'm going to hand it back to Ken. And again, remember, I'll be checking that chat. So go right ahead, Ken.
Thank you. Well, hello. Nice catching up to everybody again. I think I've been with this crowd before for a couple things, forensics and motivational interviewing, things like that. So this time we're going to talk about process dependency, the different types, treatment options, and also some supportive strategies for recovery from process dependency. And as Dawn mentioned before, the language used in Washington is a little different than the language used in New Jersey at this point regarding things like process dependency and substance use. We're still very much using the words addiction in New Jersey, even in the 12-step community, which I'm a member of. So I am going to do my best to keep the language on point today. My materials was the source of the problems with the language. So, but the other thing I want to say is if you hear me use the word addict or addiction, I want you to know that it is not in the pejorative sense. I identify as a recovering addict, a person in recovery. So I do not use that in a pejorative sense, but that's the language I've been using for about 20 years. So I'm going to make every effort to stay on point for this presentation, but you may hear me slip during the course of it. So with that, let's get rolling, and we're gonna start with the language of the DSM. So to start out by talking about process dependency, we're going to start by talking a little bit about what has been called substance abuse and addiction, and as it looks in the DSM. So here's the definition right out of the book: the cluster of cognitive, behavioral, and physiological symptoms in the individual, and they continue using despite the problems. And it's described as a pathological pattern of behavior. So you can see there's some technical, almost stigmatizing language right in there. In addition, they don't really talk about this as much as they could, but the social and spiritual impact of this as well. So, you know, the damage that is done affects a person's whole life. It's not just something that is symptoms. So the way the DSM looks at it now is they really classify everything into substance related and then addictive disorders. And what they mean by addictive disorders is really just what's been called pathological gambling. But along with that, there's all of these other process dependencies, or what has been called process addictions, like sex, like compulsive exercise, shopping, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we're going to go into those in a little more detail today about how those behavioral dependencies are similar to and are also different from substance use. The definition of addiction, we could probably spend an hour going back and forth on that all by itself. The simplest one that I heard was from a CADC who said, it hurts you, but you keep doing it. And I thought that was kind of one of the essences of the addictive process, is the idea that it hurts, and actually as it goes on, it hurts more and more and more. But if anything, the use intensifies along with the consequences. So again, going straight out of the DSM here, these are the diagnostic criteria for substance use disorder. And I highlighted a few of my favorite ones in here. So the person uses more than they intend. They keep trying to stop. In fact, one of my favorite lines about that is, oh, I'm really good at stopping. I've stopped 1,000 times. Tend to get very good at stopping, but the restart always follows. An increasing amount of time obtaining, using, and recovering from use, including the lies and the cover up and all that stuff. And eventually it becomes the person's whole life. That's that downward spiral where a person's whole life becomes that pattern. The presence of cravings. One of the things I really look for is what they call role abandonment, which is failure to fulfill obligations due to use. So now that thing is starting to bump other things out. You know, oh, maybe I don't need to go to work today. Maybe I don't need to go pick up my kids. Maybe I don't need to do this thing. Maybe I don't need to pay this bill because I'd rather do this. And it just gets in the way of more and more and more things in that person's life. Continued use despite persistent, recurrent, and even escalating problems. Activities given up due to use. This is that role abandonment again. Use in situations which could be hazardous, the way people endanger themselves and others by efforts to obtain, and to use. Continued use despite physical, psychological problems. And then the classic two in the old DSMs, these were the standard between substance use and substance dependence. So one was the tolerance. It takes more and more to get the same result. And then the withdrawals, which is the impact on that person due to their use. And I just saw a hand go up. So is there somebody has Marcola?
Go ahead, Marcola, if you'd like to speak, you have the mic.
No, I didn't. That was an accident.
Oh, but it's wonderful to hear your voice.
Forgive me. I've had a cup of coffee, but obviously it's not enough.
I'm just about to order mine, so it's okay. It's all right.
So you gave us an opportunity to show that we do actually pay attention to those things. So that's a win anyway.
Okay,
Thank you. Sorry.
No problem. So that's been the old DSM textbook use at the substance use disorders. Now, where we start to get, I would say, interesting is when we move into the area of process dependency. We don't need a drug anymore. We don't need alcohol anymore. There's no substance needed for this. The issue is the process. And of course, in what's been called substance abuse, The process is interesting too, right? The obtaining of the thing is its own ritual and has its own addictive component. Well, here, this is where it's the whole thing. It really is about the chase and the going through of this process for the person. The process dependencies have been greatly enhanced by the role of technology. The idea that you can engage in your addiction or your dependency anywhere, anytime, anyhow, as close by as your phone or your laptop, which for many of us is the device that we work on. So think about that. You might have someone who is recovering from alcohol use. Well, their role is to avoid alcohol. If my addiction or my dependency has to do with computers and I work on a computer, there we are. It's basically the alcoholic working in the liquor store, sort of scenario. Process dependency can be harder to spot. Sometimes it doesn't have all those telltale signs, especially at the beginning, that a substance use disorder may have. Abstinence, we're going to talk about this in much greater detail. Abstinence may not be possible, nor may it be desirable. So some of these behaviors that form process dependencies are necessary. So again, if my problem involves the computer and I need the computer to work or I need the computer to function, that's going to be a challenge. When I get into recovery, that's something I'm going to have to be able to deal with. And we're going to talk about how you can divide out healthy and unhealthy use, which is a critical process in process dependencies. So there are probably so many of these that I can't even wrap my head around them. With any kind of process, there can be a process dependency. I'm going to pick on a couple of the ones that are more common that I think you're going to have more exposure to. It struck me that what has been called workaholism would probably belong on here as well. And since many of us work in mental health, we probably have multiple jobs. So this may be hitting closer to home than we want anyway, but I'm going to stick to these 5 just for the time being. But this is definitely a developing area. I don't have the data to back this up, but I would think that the process dependencies are growing at least as fast as substance use is, in part because of tech. So the one process dependency that's been fully acknowledged in the DSM is gambling. And I'm not going to read every word on this slide. I tried to bold a few of them just to make it easy. But what I wanted to emphasize here was the things that you're looking for. And again, it goes back to those things we were talking about before. Increasing amounts, that craving, that restless irritability when the person is trying to cut down or trying to stop. They've tried to stop. In fact, they've successfully stopped on many, many, many occasions. They just keep restarting. The preoccupation, the obsessive nature of the dependency. It's obsessiveness followed by the behavior. The use of gambling. So I don't feel well, gambling is going to make me feel better. I need this, I need this hit to make me feel better. I need my little, my dopamine hit. The idea of, this one's a classic, when the person's going to win their money back. So yeah, I lost on the first day, but I'm going to go back again today and win it back. Okay, yep, we're in trouble when that one begins. The idea of lying, and it's not even just as simple as lying. To a certain degree, the person may believe it. They have to believe it to keep this going. But to the people around them, that person is lying. And of course, the classic gambler's fallacy, which is the person always thinks they're doing better than they really are. If they were really accurately measuring where things were, they would be in a lot more, worse shape, the minimizing aspect of it. Has jeopardized or lost a significant job or other thing because of gambling, and relies on others to provide money, because most of these process dependencies have more in common than they do different, but they each have their own characteristics and their own specific hazards. Now with gambling, it becomes money because that's the main thing that's dealt with. So one of the hallmarks of someone who is gambling is they have financial problems, and then that creates other issues. And we'll talk about how that same process works in the other process dependencies, but maybe not as much about money, but more in other areas. But that's how the spiral begins and the consequences begin to escalate. So an interesting thing that's happened recently is that internet gaming has gone from being one of the, I would say would be one of the minor players here, to becoming probably what is going to be the next one that gets formally accepted by the DSM and by the formal community, as a process dependency or as a process addiction. So it was listed in the DSM-5 as a condition for further study, which is a good sign from their perspective. And again, you can see this list here. Some of these same symptoms and characteristics are there. There's a preoccupation, the withdrawals there, the tolerance is there, the inability to reduce, the giving up of other activities, just continuing to play despite increasing problems, minimizing to the people around them, the use of the thing to relieve negative feelings. Again, if we'll talk a little bit more about process dependencies as being used to medicate symptoms, medicate trauma. And here's the use of this gaming for that. And same deal, having made risk or lost things due to gaming. So this one has become, it's just exploded in popularity. I was at an ACA conference and there was a discussion about internet gaming, and they said that the money that changes hands in internet gaming would be the equivalent of the state of California, which is the 5th largest economy in the world. There's a bit of a stereotype out there that compulsive internet gamers are, teenagers who live in their parents' basement. And what they find is that gamers tend to be married, have kids, have jobs, often in the tech field. I think the average age was 42 years old. So this, at my age, I remember Pong coming in the house. It was one of the greatest days of my life when we actually had a video game, which was really just 2 little white lines and a white dot going back and forth. It was one of the highlights of my childhood, believe it or not. Shout out if anybody remembers Pong. So I've kind of grown up with this. So I know there are people that are my age and my generation, and especially right behind that when the game started getting better, that this has become part of their livelihood. And as that has become much more mainstream and much more influential, this is out there.
Ken, could I just wanted to ask you a question
Sure.
about gaming dependence. Does this, and maybe I missed this, I'm sorry, but does this also include, or how are folks looking at other types of internet addiction, whether it be social media?
Yes. Yep.
So because I think that, gaming is just one piece of it. And I'm just curious if that's also being looked at. And if you think, and this is just a kind of aside, the level of realism that is now seen in gaming, do you think that makes it like more likely that somebody may develop a dependence because it's like another world you can walk into in a lot of ways?
So let me hit both of those, and I don't want to forget that other part. So what I've started to see happening, and again, this is the New Jersey terminology, is something called screen addiction. So screen addiction is, okay, I work on my computer all day. Okay, phew, boy, I'm done work. Boy, that's better. I'm done. I'm really glad to be done. Looking at that
I know about that.
Boy, that was terrible. Okay. All right. So now that's done. And I think I'm going to go home and play some video games now. And then now, granted, those of us, you go into a restaurant and you see an entire family sitting together and everyone's on their phone and no one's talking to each other. That's a pretty, if you do a quick panorama of any restaurant or anywhere out, half the people in the place are on their screens. But if you take that to its furthest degree, where you go from screen to screen to screen, and if there is nothing besides that, so the screen addiction is taking on its own thing. So being online can have its own addictive tendencies. I hate that little feature on my phone that tells me how many hours a day I've been looking at my phone. That's always a depressing thing, because these things have become the center of our lives. We didn't have this, thing, and now it's become so incredibly handy. So yeah, there's a screen addiction which can be considered separate from gaming, because not everybody who goes from screen to screen to screen is playing games. So that's its own thing. Regarding the games, I absolutely agree with you. I don't think they had inpatient units for people from playing Pong 20 hours a day. I don't think it was possible. But
Definitely not.
I would have been the first one, maybe. I'm not sure. I came in at the beginning, but it's become more and more realistic. I mean, video games are more realistic than movies, I think, to a certain degree. They use a higher level of technology, and of course, where this particular process dependency comes in, and I think this one is going to be giving us more and more and more problems as time goes on. I worry about this one because it can be so individually tailored to the person. So a drug is a drug, and the goal is you want the drug to be more powerful, so it has more of an effect, and wow, that was great. This one you can tweak right to the person. And I notice gambling does this to a degree too. If you go into a casino, you see there are certain different types of games, but there are all these machines that basically do the same thing, but they all have this little nuance to them.
Like the slot machines in Atlantic City that you have. For me, I see the Wonder Woman slot machine and I want to run right to it, right? Because it reminds me of my childhood.
Dawn goes right to Wonder Woman. I see the Lord of the Rings, and I'm over there. It's the same game. But what they've done is they've just tweaked it a little bit because they're trying to get to that part of Dawn's brain. They're trying to get to that part of her brain and that part of mine.
More potent.
Potent and individualized.
Yes.
To a degree. So that's why this makes me nervous.
And to elaborate on that, because I do play some internet games and they're like the slot machine things, and no, I don't spend any money on them, but you're right. That's what I do to relax after I just spent 8 hours on my computer for work, right? I switch to my phone. But one of the things that I've noticed is also advertisements for games that hit at different areas that could be potentially problematic for people, sexualized games, these sorts of things, games where there is drug use featured in it. So it's almost like one of the things that, and I love games, but one of the things that makes me pause is that they are building games that hit at all those different unique characteristics that people may make people prone to certain dependencies.
The where you hear about this the most is in the rise of first person shooter games. So, wherever there is a mass shooting, the video games always gets brought up as a reference. And there's a weakness to that argument because there are people in different countries that consume far more first person shooter video games than we do that do not have the amount of gun violence that we have. But it does stand to reason that if you're playing Call of Duty 20 hours a day, we put a real weapon in your hand, you're probably in a better position than Mr. Pong over here with a weapon, because you've had all of this practice, this virtual practice. So it's a very, very controversial area there. And you're absolutely right. Some of the games, there's some games, you've got the Candy Crushes and you've got all that kind of stuff out there, but then you've got games that really reward, and I'm blank, Grand Theft Auto, that really reward antisocial behavior. I was looking for a new game console, and the salesperson told me about this Grand Theft game where you could, you got a certain amount of money, and then you could get a hooker, and then you could kill the hooker, and you wouldn't have to pay her. And I'm thinking, I'm kind of looking for, Pac-Man and maybe some Madden football. That's kind of who you're dealing with here, but that's not the market. That's clearly not where the tendency is. It's got to be more realistic, more extreme, more interactive, and again, these games are modified and tweaked to exactly get at someone, and entice them. And there's a limitless supply of these types of games. So this one makes me a little nervous in terms of how it's going to continue to grow. And I think it's grown under the surface because a lot of process dependencies, they're more invisible, I think, until they get to a really bad place. We've all may have known the person that came to work smelling a little bit like alcohol or looking a little red-eyed or maybe none the worse for wear after, partaking in some sort of substances. These things I think keep a lower profile until much later in the game when the person is much worse hooked in. The other part about this gaming is that people have made livings in this. One person I was working with was making more money than me creating characters for people. So he would create these characters from start and then sell them. And he was also in these tournaments. So he was this was his career. This was his livelihood. Unfortunately, it was also having a very terrible impact on his health and what was going to be his marriage. So there comes the impetus. This is where this goes too far. But then in this person's recovery, do they have to give up their career? And that's something that this person has to.
Yeah. And I wanted to just mention that when you talked about, these as being a little bit more insidious and covert in their manifestation until it gets really, really difficult for the individual and they start to not be able to function and meet their, expectations of their daily living. I would guess that a lot of these dependencies, when we talk about process dependencies, are also on their surface more socially accepted
Hmm.
activities, right? Than smoking crack or IV heroin use. They're more mainstream, they are more socially acceptable.
Sure. I mean, as much as particularly marijuana has become much more socially acceptable, I would have to think that calling somebody up and saying, "Hey, man, we're getting together, we're playing Call of Duty tonight," which, by the way, we can all do from our respective homes. We don't even have to get together to actually do it. We can, but we don't have to. As opposed to, "Hey, let's all get together and get high." One of these sounds much more innocent to the ear, probably the parent's ear, but at the same time, it's free to get a lot worse. And you're right, the more socially acceptable something is, the harder it is to find that line where, hey, how harmful is this? If it's not illegal and it doesn't carry some of those other stigmas, then what's wrong with it? And again, that's where we get into the role displacement, role abandonment. That's where the problems begin. I didn't go to school because I was playing today, or I didn't sleep last night because I was trying to get my ranking up, so I didn't sleep that night. And then, of course, far worse than that. In fact, this gentleman I was just telling you about, he played straight through a night to try to develop this character that he was trying to sell. He played for the better part of a day. I think it was somewhere along the lines of 18 hours. He got up from his desk, became lightheaded, and fell down the stairs in his own house. So he's at the bottom of the stairs, all crumpled up, and they had to take him to the emergency room for severe dehydration. So, I mean, this guy he's just neglecting himself to play this, to the point where, I mean, it theoretically could have been life-threatening for him. And that was when his fiance told him he was getting help. So that's where that is. That was the impetus. So now, for a couple of these going forward, these are not listed in the DSM-5. They're mentioned, but they're not fully classified as criteria. So what I did was, and I stole this idea from Dr. Patrick Carnes, who's referenced in this, is I took the categories that the DSM uses for dependency, and I just superimposed them on these particular dependencies to show how they work the same way. So the categories are exactly the same as you've seen, but this is not how they're listed out in the actual book, but they work the same way. So you have preoccupation. Preoccupation is with sexual acting out. Withdrawal, when that thing isn't possible. Sadness, person's anxious, they're very irritable. Same deal for tolerance. You need to go further and further with it to get the same effect. Someone who is dependent on pornography. Regular pornography doesn't do it anymore. It needs to get more and more and more extreme, and usually extreme at some point turns into illegal. So you have to go further and further and further out.
Ken, just to interject, because I'm the sexual health person, define regular pornography.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, I don't even want to go there. So,
okay, thank you.
No, I don't even want to go there. And I'll tell you why, because with a lot of these things, 90% of the people that use them don't have a problem. And I'm not saying pornography is good or bad in and of itself. I'm not making a judgment about that at all. But for 90% of the people, it will not be a significant problem for them in their life. There is a difference in how that remaining percentage of people consume pornography, frequency, I would say severity, in fact, how extreme the pornography is when you're talking about someone that's underage or rape or something along those lines, because that's where it goes. The average consumer of pornography stays at a traditional level of pornography, which would be just, a male or a female or something like that. There's something that would be considered a little less extreme. The person who is developing the dependency is going to move past that. They're going to move past that into something else, usually of an illegal nature. And so that's what it looks like in terms of dangerousness here. Is it compromising the relationship that you're in because you're watching porn all night instead of being with your partner? Or are you watching a type of pornography that may have some legal ramifications for you, to the point of landing you on a registry or getting you incarcerated? The other thing, and I actually thought this was what you were going to interrupt on, and probably should have. I should have broken out the sexual process dependency and the love process dependency. So in this area, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, there's a differentiation made between people who are dependent on sex and people who are dependent on love, kind of similar to what has been called codependency in the past. So someone who has a sexual dependency is watching porn all the time or engaging in anonymous hookups, maybe preying on people in their job, subordinates. There's like 62 at least different types of sexual acting out. And a person has this pattern and they just do it and go further and further and further with it. And that's where they differentiate themselves from the 90% who watch pornography and go about their lives or do whatever other behavior they do. So, but the sex is the central point of it. The love dependency is someone who goes from relationship to relationship. They can't be out of a relationship, and most of the relationships that they get in are not healthy. They may be exploitative. They may be unhealthy for them in some way, but they'll go from one to the next, And then these are also not mutually exclusive. Of course, the connection between relationship and sex. So there are people that consider themselves sex and love dependent. They'll lump themselves together in that realm as well. So, and again, with sex and with love, they still fit these categories: preoccupation, withdrawals when they don't have what they want, the tolerance. So you need to have a certain type of thing, that it's not the relationship, it's this thing that you're looking for. It isn't even necessarily about the sex anymore. It's almost about the ritual. One person that I worked with had a fetish website that had no sexual content on it whatsoever. In fact, the part that was most frequently used on his website was something called crush videos, which is women, usually women, crushing things with their feet or tearing things apart with their feet, like a roll, a Portuguese roll. This person made a fortune on making videos of that nature. So it's kind of this fetish area too, where the sex disappears, but now it's all about the fetish. So it's more about the feet than anything else, or whatever other fetish there may be. Inability to reduce sexual acting out behavior. Again, the person's quit 1,000 times. They're really good at quitting, just not so good at staying quit. Role abandonment takes the place of everything else. You spend 8 hours looking at porn overnight, you're no good the next day, and this becomes part of a cycle. The legal problems. So much like we mentioned with gambling, money becomes a central issue here. Very often, particularly with sex addiction, legal issues become the central problem here, because at some point, prostitution may be involved. Workplace harassment might be involved. Underage people may become involved. There's all these other legal entanglements, and that's one of those things that directs people in. However, I do not want to paint people who have sex addiction in terms of involvement with children is just one aspect of it. There are many, many, many other types of acting out. And actually, most people who have sex addiction do not go in that particular direction. So I don't want to overlap that too much. There's a huge, huge stigma around this particular process dependency, as you can imagine. We are a pretty sex negative culture. And so this one packs a particularly strong stigma. Deceiving family members or others about the amount of time and money spent, same deal. This one you have to lie about. If there's something to lie about, it's sex, because it's not something that we talk about in an open manner under normal circumstances anyway. I wish that had changed over the generations, but I don't know if it has. I just think the internet has become our answer to all sexual questions.
Well, if people want to talk about sex, I'll be talking about sex later on today at 2 p.m. Western time, 5 p.m. Eastern time. You can tune in.
I did not mean to set that up like that, but that worked like a charm.
Thank you for the setup.
There we go. So the use of sex to relieve negative moods. So again, the idea of using something or medicating with something, doing something to change my mood. Same deal. This can result in someone losing a job. I also threw in freedom, because that's often the case. In New Jersey, people that have maxed out their prison sentences for child sex offenses are diverted to our state psychiatric hospitals, where they can be detained indefinitely. I don't know of any other crime where that's the case. If you kill someone, you're found guilty of murder, you max out your sentence and you leave. Here, we keep you, so that it speaks to how powerful that stigma really is.
Does it also speak to the power of the process versus somebody who committed, say, the crime of murder under certain circumstances, and there's not a dependence process there?
Yeah.
that contribute
Well, yeah,
to
in most
that
cases there aren't. We're sort of fascinated with serial killers where there may be
And
that need.
right. And so it's that risk of repeat, right?
Oh yeah, that's definitely part of it. My own impression of this is that the sex addiction or the process dependency involving sex is the most primal. So I think it's the one that's underlying a lot of other ones. So for example, someone might come in to help for alcoholism. And this is an actual example from my own practice. He did not come in for any sort of sexual related issue, came in to recover from alcoholism. However, his biggest trigger whenever he would be sober was he would find himself being attracted to little kids, and then he would relapse because the thoughts he was having were completely unacceptable. So he would drink. And if he was not able to drink, if he was not able to medicate those unacceptable impulses, he would then have suicidal thoughts. So we were doing all this stuff. What we got underneath there was that there was a sexually addictive component underneath, which we had to get to. And then there was trauma underneath that, and we'll get to that a little bit as well. So you'll see layers of these, because that's another issue. It doesn't really help us very well to talk about these substance use disorders and the process dependencies as all separate things. The process has much more in common, and most people that we work with have multiples of these. So the idea of putting people in a box where, okay, here's the person who has who has a substance use disorder around cocaine. Here's the person that has the process dependency of gambling. No, people either have multiple at once or they go through several of them during the course of their lives. So the separating out isn't as helpful. And we've treated them as separate, as I'll talk about later. So a controversial area here is the idea of food as a process dependency, because in the DSM it gets covered in these other areas under eating disorders. However, with clients that you're working with or people you're working with who have this sort of situation, this model, the addictive model, may be helpful to a certain degree. Do they fit these characteristics? Do they have a tolerance toward food? And that tolerance is, of course, high and getting higher as time goes on. Do they have withdrawal symptoms when they can't have what they want in that point in time? Using larger amounts than intended. Again, somebody who's promised to quit 1,000 times and keeps coming back to the table. More time and effort used to obtain and recover from. Reduction of other activities because now they're going to clash, with this process dependency, and where things clash with the process dependency, they're going to get abandoned. They're going to let go. I imagine one of the other ones that goes along with this is a lot of shame about a person's body image, which will change for someone in there. So with gambling, we talk about the money. With sex, we talk about the potential legal complications. With someone who has a process dependency around food, we're going to talk about their health and their body image and how that impacts their life going forward and their relationships. And then last but not least on here, use of this, I'll call it a substance because that's where I stole the definition from, despite ongoing physical, psychological, in parentheses, medical problems caused by this. Okay, and another one, and talk about socially acceptable process dependencies, compulsive shopping and compulsive buying. So same deal. Having these same criteria, the tolerance, the withdrawal. Very often people have a particular thing that they like to buy, and so that becomes the pattern for them. I'm familiar with a person who has bought so many pairs of shoes that one room in her house is completely dedicated to shoes. Well, she and her husband are talking about having a child. Well, where's that child going to go? Not in the shoe room. I'm not going to put them in there. And so now there's a clash. And of course, at some level, she realizes she has a problem. She's bought the same shoes, but now she's embarrassed to take them back because she's bought them from the same place. So you can kind of see how the net sort of ensnares you after a while. It starts out as a socially acceptable behavior. In fact, a socially rewarded behavior to a certain degree. But then at a certain point, it turns. And then now the roles start to get abandoned, the roles start to get neglected, and then other problems develop. So again, the same symptoms you see here, the same features that you've seen in those other characteristics. Because at the end of the day, it isn't about the shoes, it's about the ritual. It's about the first half of a process that starts with obsession and then has this compulsive behavior, which almost but doesn't make that obsessive feeling go away. So we're going to be back again. So been in the field for a little over 30 years, and we love to argue about which came first. And so I finally found a nice picture of a chicken and an egg, or at least a chick anyway. So which came first? Is it this psychiatric distress? Is it the symptoms of depression or anxiety or whatever that's going on that fuel the need for this repetitive behavior to deal with all of this stress and negative feelings it's caused? Or is it the other way? Is it there's this behavior there, and now we have all of this stuff to worry about? And in the literature, we've gotten a little bit better with it, where we've talked about it's usually the signs of distress first. There's some prodromal signs of depression or anxiety or something else. And then, so a person's just looking for that relief. So if you feel pain, if you feel physical pain, it makes sense. All right, I'm going to find something to help me deal with this pain. And again, the problem is it doesn't make the pain go away. It lessens it to a certain degree. And then the tolerance starts to kick in. And of course, at no point are we actually addressing the problem of where the pain came from. We're trying to numb pain instead of fix the problem. So here we go. And eventually, the cure becomes the disease, so to speak. So just to elaborate on that a little bit. So when very often the people that I'm working with who have these process dependencies and substance use disorders, that's usually the thing that's out front. What can we do about this alcohol problem? What can we do about the sex problem? What can we do about this drug problem? And a person who is in that situation is so happy when they finally start to get some clean time. They're like, oh, that's so good. I've been clean for a week, 2 weeks, a month. At first they feel so much better. But then the thing that drives the use comes back, because now we're not medicating the beast anymore. And pardon me the analogy, but I kind of refer to it that way. So whatever the thing that was driving that person to use, whether it was symptoms of anxiety, symptoms of depression, mood swings, all that stuff comes up. You know, my colleagues who work in detox facilities, you see this all the time. Someone starts looking better and better and better as the drug starts to leave their system. And then two things happen. One is the medical withdrawal part of it. But the other part of it is whatever they were using comes back with a vengeance, you know, like some sort of weird symptom rebound, right? So now whatever you had going on, it's front and center. So of course, what do you do about it? You either relapse and go right back to it again, or you need to develop a whole new dependency. There needs to be a whole new outlet for this, which we'll talk about very shortly. And then last but not least, what's driving those symptoms, you know, of mental illness or whatever you want to call it? Underneath that, it is very often trauma. Very often that person is medicating traumatic material that is manifested in this psychiatric way, and then the addiction, it's like, so these are the layers of the onion, right? You start with that surface layer, get that person clean for a little bit, and you start to see what's underneath that. And then you get underneath that and you see the trauma that's underlying it. I have yet to work with a person with a severe dependency on a substance or a process that did not have some traumatic material underneath. Now it's just, yeah, you almost assume it's there until you hear otherwise. And that's a sad state of affairs. I don't know if anybody here is a fan of Whack-A-Mole. We have lots of these machines at the Jersey Shore, and I'm a big fan. So I decided to steal it. And this is kind of how a lot of recovery works with substances and processes. So you know how Whack-A-Mole works, right? The mole sticks up his head, you hit him on the head with a hammer, and he pops up somewhere else, or he pops up back in the same place again later on, and your job is to keep hitting him with the hammer. It's actually a fun game if you've never done it. So I stole this because to me, this is how it works. So this person may have a problem with alcohol. Okay, I'm going to go through all this work and whack that alcohol thing down. So, okay, I'm good. I'm done with alcohol. But if I don't do the work underneath that, then guess what? Now I'm smoking all sorts of weed. So there we are. So now I've got that going on. When I finally get that under control, then I see my doctor, they give me Xanax, and now I've got a whole other way to go. And of course, the processes fit in with this just as easily as the substances do. And not to go off on too much of a tangent, I'm trying to watch time, but there are, people are looking for the same effect. So someone who is into gambling might be somebody who might work well with cocaine because they're looking for that rush. They're not looking for a relaxation effect. They're looking for a stimulant sort of effect. So there's an up, there's a down, and there's an out. And that's what people tend to substitute. So it wouldn't necessarily work the same way from someone to go from using methamphetamine to, say, Xanax. They're looking for a different thing. Cocaine to meth would be a natural transition. So unless the work is done underneath where this mole comes from, it's just going to pop up again, either in the same place or somewhere else. So another aspect about process dependency is you may not be able to be abstinent from this thing. You know, in the good old days, the Nancy Reagan days, we had just say no. So just don't drink, just don't use drugs, don't do any of that kind of stuff. That was the message. Well, what happens when the behavior that you're indulging in is a behavior that is natural to indulge in? So a behavior like sex, or a behavior like shopping, or a behavior like eating. So how do you do that? You're not planning on not eating ever again. That doesn't sound like a great treatment plan. So one model that's been used is something called the 3 circles. And you see a decent example, not a great example of one here for, say, someone that's a gambler. So how it works is the green outer circle are healthy behaviors. These are the things that you do to cope that help you to feel better. In the middle, the yellow circle are the risky behaviors. So it's the proverbial person with an alcohol problem in the liquor store, right? And there are different types of triggers there. It can be internal triggers or external triggers. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then in the inner circle, these are the unhealthy behaviors. So when someone's in a 12-step fellowship, they talk about how much clean time they have. And that means, okay, it's been this many days. It's been 90 days since I bet on the horses. You know, so that's the bottom line behavior that they're looking at. So just to step back to middle circle for a minute. So our goal is that a person lives in their outer circle, right? They live in a world where they meditate, call their sponsor. Other things that would be in these circles would be healthy things, spending time with family, working, all that good stuff. I want to live in that green zone around the outside. When I move into the yellow zone, that means that something's wrong. Something has triggered me somehow, and I'm now I'm wobbly. I'm not quite centered anymore. And those things can be internal or external. So for example, if this person drove by the casino that they used to gamble at, okay, that might be a trigger for them. And if they know they have to be there, if I have to go to Atlantic City to do a conference and I'm going to be in a casino and I am in recovery from gambling, okay, I got to do some game planning before that happens. Maybe I can't do it. Or maybe there's a way I can make myself safer. But when I get there, I might feel this middle circle feeling like, okay, I'm not in such a great place right now. The other things that are viewed as triggers are internal states. In Alcoholics Anonymous, I think, came up with something called HALT, which is hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. HALT, even though they're not necessarily related to drinking, they tend to precede relapse. So hungry, angry, lonely, tired. And the people that I've worked with added to that. We've made it HALT BS. So it's hungry, angry, lonely, tired, bored, and stressed, because they belong, right? Are you more likely to indulge in a behavior that isn't healthy for you if you're bored or stressed? For me, the answer is definitely yes. So, but it can also be external things. I see something. There's a friend of mine who's been sober from alcohol 30 years. He still gets cold sweats when he sees those Coors Light Silver Bullet train commercials. You know, those still pack a meaning for him. And for a while, they were on like every 2 minutes. They were completely unavoidable. So part of working with someone in recovery, if they can't be completely abstinent, is they have to form these circles. Now, you can't BS yourself and say, oh, no, well, it's okay if I go to the casino once a month. You have to make these things so that they are achievable, but also realistic. The inner circle behaviors always lead to trouble. The middle circle behaviors are sort of the smoke alarm, yellow light warning sign. And the green is, this is where you want to be. You want to operate in this place as much as possible and know when you've left it.
So Ken, from a helping perspective, is this something that can be turned into an exercise that staff can do with an individual to identify what is their green zone, what is their yellow zone, and what is the red zone?
Absolutely.
So
Yeah, I've actually made
also
up
be
worksheets
included to support them.
Sure. I've actually made up worksheets. I don't know if there's a way of getting these out there, but I've made worksheets for these that have blank versions of these circles and the instructions so that people can write them in, because it's funny when you work with someone who is very recently clean or not clean, they'll fill the inner circle. They'll fill it. They'll fill the middle circle. And then when you ask them what the outer circle is, they'll go, well, I don't know, sleep it off. You know, they don't have, it's just not there. So part of the recovery process is, okay, what are these things going to be? Am I going to go fishing? You know, am I going to read a book? Like what are the things that are going to work for, you know, we can't write it out for them. They've got to write it out. So, and things will move. Things will move from inner to middle. New things will come up that didn't even exist before. There might be an app on your phone that, you know what, that's a middle circle or that's an inner circle. So I got to pop that in there. So I'll give you a very specific example of how this works. I work with a lot of people that have the process dependency of what we'd call sex addiction. So just to be completely blunt and honest about it, one of the trickiest aspects of sex addiction to do in the 3 circles is something like masturbation. Some people are compulsive and they can't. If they do, it's done. The relapse is in full flight. There may be another person who uses masturbation to keep them from indulging in a more dangerous behavior. I'm not going to go to the go-go bar. I'm not going to go on this hookup website. I'm not going to go to, you know, I'm not going to go cruise for prostitutes. I'm going to stay home and this is going to be a preventive measure. So, okay, so maybe that's more of a middle circle. And then there's other people where masturbation doesn't have any addictive component to them at all. Their sexual acting out is completely unrelated to that. So the same thing could be in 3 different circles depending on that person. So part of the role of recovery is to help them find all of those things. And it's nice because you're working with them together on it. Instead of they are the person in recovery and we're the staff person kind of coming down on them and telling them what to do and what not to do. You can work on this together. So I'll send those sheets along to Dawn and Dawn can get them out if that's something that can help you. You can also look it up. It's also there in 3 circles is out there in different degrees as well. So treatment, we talked about a little bit. So kind of standard there. It's funny that the DSM doesn't recognize a lot of these process dependencies because they're inpatient facilities for them all around the country and all around the world. So somebody's a little late getting to the dance here. There are units that are specialized for inpatient, for internet gaming. There are facilities for, you know, sexual process dependency, all that stuff. They're out there. Outpatient therapy, and I can't emphasize this enough. One of the bad habits that we as therapists have is we say that we have specialties in everything, and we don't. Just because, you know, I may have gone to a training on something doesn't mean I'm an expert in it now. So very important to know about certifications and all that kind of stuff. What sort of background does that person have? Do they really know what they're talking about? Because some of these can go really bad if someone isn't qualified. Medications, there's a use of medication to address the cravings. That's probably a whole other conversation, but I know naltrexone and there are other things that have been used to help reduce the desire to use. 12 steps, I'm sure you're familiar with. We'll talk about them a little bit more, but the whole idea that you make this sort of table out of the following legs: having a sponsor, someone who's been in this longer than you and further into it than you to help you through the process. Fellowship, you have a group of people that know exactly what you're talking about and have the exact same issue that you can talk to. Doing the step work, and there's a great step guide I'll share with you in the references later that's actually works across different dependencies. So it's not just, okay, here's your AA 12 steps, here's your NA 12 steps. It's one that's much more comprehensive. And also having a safety net. You know, who are when things go bad, who's the person you're going to reach out to? Who are you going to call? Who are you going to text? And there's a whole group of people. And in a lot of the literature, they'll say you want to have all these things, you want to have all these pillars in place along with therapy to get whatever's underneath. Remember that trauma and those symptoms that are driving the dependency. You know, what is it? Pretty standard here. You have the different 12-step fellowships. I tried to include one from each of the ones that we were talking about, and of course AA, because almost all of these are derivative from AA. They all have their own big book. They have their own structure. It's 90% the same thing. One of the problems with the 12 steps, and trust me, I'm a fan, I'm a 12-stepper, but there are some challenges in it. One of them is you can't go into an AA meeting and talk about your drug habit, or you can't go into an NA meeting and talk about your sexual dependency. They really want it specific to that thing, and there's a hierarchy. So there are AA meetings in every town, but you may not be able to, if you're not an alcoholic, if you have a different sort of thing going on, you might not work in that room so well. One of the things about COVID that happened is it made all these meetings online. So it negated the idea that, hey, my nearest NA meeting is 3 towns away and I don't have transportation, but I can walk to an AA meeting. COVID, as long as somebody has internet access, they can reach out to any of those. One other type of treatment that I wanted to talk about, and we have videos and some information about this one as well. In fact, I'd be happy to come back and do this again. For this one is something called Smart Recovery. Smart Recovery, you can find it online. It's similar to the 12 steps, but it has some pretty pronounced differences. One is it doesn't have the spiritual/religious component that the 12 steps has. That does create a problem for some people. It doesn't have the emphasis on, we mentioned, it doesn't have the emphasis on God or higher power. It also doesn't require the idea of someone surrendering to a higher power and saying, okay, hi, I'm Ken and I'm an addict. It doesn't have that part. A person is who they are and they frame the problem the way they see it. And they also, in AA, in the derivatives, you have these 12 steps that you go through in sequence. So Smart Recovery doesn't work that way. It doesn't have the spiritual component. It doesn't have that piece where you have to say, okay, I'm surrendering to a higher power and I'm an addict. Instead, they have these materials which are available online about these 4 points, which you can do in any order you feel like: building motivation, coping with urges, problem solving, and lifestyle balance. The Smart Recovery has a lot of CBT stuff in it. It has a lot of motivational interviewing and stages of change. As Smart Recovery is its own thing, but it's also an amalgam of a bunch of other things as well. So it has been very helpful. We're running that in the hospital side by side with the 12 steps, because there's some people that don't like the 12-step model, maybe had a bad experience with it or don't like the sounds of it. And then we've got Smart Recovery for them. Some people view addictions recovery as a spiritual process. So they want that piece. So that's why, we definitely encourage running both of these so you can cast a wider net and get people involved in the treatment. So summary, covered a lot of ground in a short period of time. I was talking too much, I think, but we'll get to the Q&A in a minute. So for each of these issues have their own individual details, but they have more similarities. And of course, we notice people move from one to another. One of the cornerstone pieces of the process or behavioral dependencies don't require a substance. It's the process. And it literally is the process, the ritual. Online gaming, sex and love, compulsive shopping, food, gambling, workaholism. There are a host of these. I mentioned some of the major ones, but there are so many more, out there, and probably more developing. People either tend to have multiple of these at one time, or very often there's a sequence to it. The classic story of the person who was working 80 hours a week, they start having medical problems, they cut their work hours down, so now they have more time to drink. Okay, now we have a new problem. If there's one thing I didn't go off about, this is the addictive personality. This is not to be confused with the addictive personality. That's a whole different mechanism, and there's a whole different story about that as well. Process dependencies are treated in different manners by the DSM. They're really treated as second-class citizens within the recovery community. It's sort of alcohol, drugs, gambling is sort of being led into the club, and then everything else is at this lower level, to the point where we use the term substance abuse, talk about bad language. We use the term substance abuse to include people that don't have a substance abuse problem. So that's definitely something to that. Process dependencies require different approaches than substance use disorders. Specifically, the idea of abstinence may not be a possibility in this 3-circle thing that we were talking about. Each of them has their own little individual pieces to it too, because the triggers are different. You can't go 15 minutes of your life in any sort of media without seeing an ad for a gambling site. I can't even get on the train without seeing ads for a gambling site. So each of these, when you're getting to the point where you're working with somebody, you're not only individualizing the aspects of their dependence, but you're also individualizing how they're going to be able to manage triggers going forward, including going to the train station. There are inpatient facilities for these types of treatment, outpatient facilities, and also the 12 steps, smart recovery as well. The treatment is out there and recovery is possible. I have seen people who are in the deepest depths of these dependencies, people who've been incarcerated, people who are on registries, people who have, lost their families. I've watched them reunite and build things back together again. With the proper support, it does work. It's really hard. It's probably the most difficult thing you can ask a person to do. My own recovery is the hardest thing that I've ever done, and it continues today. So, but it does work. It does work if that person, works it like their life depends on it, which it does. And of course, if the support and the treatment are there. If I could recommend one book to you, it would be this one, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts by Dr. Mate. Dr. Mate also has a bunch of really great YouTube videos. So if you don't want to necessarily drop in on the book right away, I would start with the videos. He's awesome. Just got his new book, The Myth of Normal. Haven't even started it yet, but that will happen. He wrote this great book about the link between trauma and substance abuse and process dependency, called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And it says, we constantly seek something outside ourselves to curb an insatiable yearning for relief or fulfillment. The aching emptiness is perpetual because the substances, objects, or pursuits we hope will soothe it are not what we really need. We don't know what we need. And so long as we stay in the hungry ghost mode, we'll never know. We haunt our lives without being fully present. A hungry ghost is an old character from Buddhism. It has a very tiny mouth and a big gaping stomach, or a stomach with a hole in it. So the idea is that no matter how much this hungry ghost consumes, it will never be satisfied. And he adopted that as part of his the theme for the book. And his book is in here, if you see it, that's In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. The first book on here, A Gentle Path Through the 12 Steps, is that 12-step guide that I was talking about earlier. It's non-dependent specific. So if it's good for people who have problems with alcohol, problems with sex, both, neither, other ones through time. In fact, part of it has a timeline where they actually track how they've gone through these different processes through time. We also have our link at the bottom where we have these other videos, including there's a version of this on there. And there's other ones about addictions and dependency, and one specifically about smart recovery if you're interested in following up on that. And here's more information about that. Here's the face page where all that stuff is located.
So Ken, I'm going to put that link in the link for our page in the chat box. And yes, no, I don't have wind effects in my apartment. I am enjoying the nice weather on my balcony. I'm doing my Beyonce impression. I wanted to ask a question about, from a therapist, from kind of the expert point of view of an individual who would be working with an individual in recovery from a process dependence or other dependencies. What is, if you could give advice to the case manager, the housing specialist, the person that has so much access to the individuals that they are serving that a therapist would never have, right? That level of
True.
Intimacy in terms of providing services, where very often we're being invited into a person's home, or their living environment in some way, and getting to know them, I think, or observe them also in a way that the therapist or other treatment providers would not ever have access to. So what is your advice? How does the case manager, does the care coordinator, does that person who is out there in the community as probably the main point of contact for the individual in recovery, how can they help in terms of supporting that treatment that you are working with the individual?
So, and that's assuming that a person is linked with treatment, or they may not be, right?
Right. So they may not be. So the staff may be coming into this at many different stages in a variety of stages of readiness for change.
Yeah, I would recommend, because I also work a hotline, so I get people that are calling with all sorts of things going on, and I don't know them, and they're just coming in, and they're usually coming in a great deal of distress at that point. We always say it's like trying to, when someone first comes into treatment, it's like they're trying to land a plane on an aircraft carrier, but the aircraft carrier is in rough seas and you don't even know if you can put the plane down on it. It tends not to be a pretty affair. And I always try to link people right away to meetings, particularly online meetings. I don't know how that works in a residential setting, if someone has the capacity to be able to use a computer to be able to access an online meeting.
For our crowd of participants, it would mostly be supportive housing. So, but you're right, like being able to get to that resource to connect to.
Yeah, can they get to it? Is there someone they can talk to?
And I think that that's a great point. And I just want to pause. This is more of like a technical advice for the folks that are in the room. I don't know the specifics about Washington because, again, we're in New Jersey, but I did very similar work to what all of you in supportive housing are doing now for about almost 20 years. And one of the things that is sometimes available are startup funds, and you may call them different things in Washington, but when an individual is able to obtain some sort of rental voucher through a supportive housing program, through the state, DBHR, sometimes there are monies that can be used to assist the person to do things like buy furniture, buy household items. One of the things in New Jersey that we frequently identified as necessary were computers, right? So that people who especially were isolated, and I'm going to guess that the state of Washington is probably similar to New Jersey in this way. You probably have areas of your state that have really great public transportation, which would probably be around Seattle and probably around Tacoma. As in New Jersey, it's around Newark and around Camden, right? And then the rest of the state is a dead zone in terms of transportation. So how do you get to the meetings, right? And those sorts of things. So I think also for supportive housing providers, it's necessary to think creatively, especially if they're serving people in more remote locations.
Yeah, so to get back to your point, one would be, is there a way electronically, virtually, if not in person, for that person to hit meetings? And again, there are open AA meetings where people can just come in and, you don't have to necessarily be an alcoholic, but you can get a vibe for how this works. And most of those people belong to other groups. So you're sort of accessing a network there. So is there some way to connect them with a meeting? I'm a huge fan of that Patrick Carnes book, A Gentle Path Through the 12 Steps. I mean, I would have copies of that sitting around. I mean, I used to get use out of that in the correctional facility where I worked, getting people just to start there, just to start doing the work themselves and to start thinking about it. You're not pushing it on them, but you're just encouraging them to do the work. The same thing with the smart recovery stuff. If there's somebody that can get trained in that, that's very helpful. But even if not, all of those materials are accessible online. So you can print all those things out, where if someone's more of a self-starter and they don't necessarily, might be a little slow to trusting someone else, they can start looking at that material themselves and start doing the work themselves. And of course, the other piece, if they're not hooked up with a therapist, definitely hook them up with a therapist, because what's going to happen, just like the layers of the onion we were talking about before, it starts out being all about, the getting clean time. It's all just about stopping that process in the moment, but it always ends up going back into some place where there's therapy involved. One of the most heartbreaking things to tell somebody, and I'm sure some of you can relate to this, you get somebody who gets a day of clean time, a week of clean time, a month of clean time, and they're like, whew, boy, that was terrible. Man, am I glad that's over. And then you have to be the one to break the bad news to them and say, okay, well, first of all, that's great. Congratulations. You're doing a great job. The bad news is the work has just begun. And no one likes to hear that. But at the same time, they know that it's true. Now you're ready. Now you're actually ready to do this work. That was a necessary step, but it's not sufficient. So yeah, I would say, get the materials, get the book, get the smart recovery stuff, and who are the people you're going to, refer this to. Hey, I'm even a fan. I'm not in treatment for alcohol use, but I know my local open AA meeting because I know where people are going. I've been there. I've brought people there, and I'll go there with them and get them started on it, and then go on their merry way. And they know me in the meeting and all that. And that way I can help start the process. One of the big issues, I didn't use this word in the presentation enough, and it's similar with the word is shame. Shame is one of the major enemies here. And one of the best recipes for shame is, hey, wait a minute, they've got this too. And that person has this too. Wait a minute, there's a whole room full of people and they all have this. So maybe I'm not so uniquely bad in the world. And I think that one of the underpinnings, one of the beliefs that hold these dependencies in place is I am uniquely bad. I am the only person in the world who has done something that would cause God to forsake me. I'm uniquely wretched, and everybody has their own words for that. But that's one of the things that's one of those things that person's holding on to that they need to medicate over and over and over again. And we're not going to make long-term progress until we make some progress on that.
Okay, well, I see no other questions in the chat.
I
So I'm
talked a
gonna
whole
go-
lot. Somebody bail me out. I talked way too
talked
much
a
that
whole
time.
lot. So I'm going to go ahead and read our closing slides here. We want to thank you all and appreciate your time, attention, and participation. The webinar today was hosted by DBHR through the Healthcare Authority, and we'd like to remind you that the slides, a link to the recording of this session, and a whole host of other resources will be available in the follow-up email, which you'll get in the next day or so. And that'll come from the state of Washington DBHR. So don't also forget to check out the Washington Foundational Community Supports newsletter for all things FCS and other upcoming training events. And if you are not currently a Foundational Community Support, which is FCS provider, you can reach out to AmeriGroup as the managing entity for that. And I think we did the discussion, huh? So we want to thank everybody. In the next, like I said, 24 hours or so, you will get the resources that were covered in today's webinar. We want to thank you all. If you have any questions or comments or feedback about this training after you leave and you suddenly remember, please feel free to reach out to us or to Washington DBHR, and they will get the feedback to us. We appreciate this. Enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully I'll see some of you in a couple of hours. Thank you.
Take care, and thank you for your time today. Any comments or questions, please fire away either now or later. We're interested. Also, suggestions for future trainings and topics.
Thank you all.